There are questions archaeology cannot answer, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the evidence is too strange. In the forests of northern Michigan and on a remote island in Lake Superior, there are more than 5,000 ancient mine pits. Some were dug down 20 feet into solid bedrock. And the copper that came out of those pits, over 1.5 billion pounds of it, extracted across more than 2,000 years, has almost entirely vanished. Not stolen, not buried, not consumed by some known civilization, just gone. Mainstream archaeologists say the local tribes mined it. But here's the problem. The local tribes, by their own archaeological record, used almost none of it. So who did the mining? Who took the copper? And why did it all stop, abruptly, in exactly 1200 BC? Today we're going to look at 7 pieces of this puzzle. And by the end, I promise you, the official explanation will feel like the least convincing answer in the room. Let's start with what the ground actually tells us. Along the southern shores of Lake Superior, across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale, a remote island accessible only by boat, archaeologists have identified more than 5,000 ancient mine pits, not scattered holes, not casual scratches in the earth, organized, deliberate excavations, some dug more than 6 meters into solid bedrock. The copper they were after was unlike anything found anywhere else on Earth. Lake Superior copper is 99% pure. Native copper, meaning it occurs in pure metallic form, not locked inside rock that needs smelting. You can hammer it directly into tools, into weapons, into anything. And someone did, for a very long time. Sediment samples from the lake floor show heavy metal pollution consistent with large-scale mining beginning around 6,500 BCE. The peak of activity? Between 3,000 and 1,200 BC. For over 2,000 years, this was one of the most intensively mined sites in human history. Total copper extracted, conservative estimates say 500,000 metric tons. Some researchers put it closer to 750,000. That is enough copper to supply the entire Bronze Age world. And here's what makes that sentence strange. The Bronze Age was a world desperate for copper. But if we know how much copper came out of the ground, the next question is obvious. How did they get it out? The answer looks like nothing you'd expect from a primitive operation. When European miners arrived in the Keweenaw Peninsula in the 1840s, they found the ancient pits already there. And inside those pits, something that stopped them cold. Tons. Literally tons of hammerstones. Rounded granite and quartzite cobbles, many of them grooved for hafting onto wooden handles. Thousands of them scattered across Isle Royale and the Keweenaw. Some pits contained so many that early miners simply shoveled them aside to reach the ore below. The technique these ancient miners used was called fire setting. Build a fire against the copper-bearing rock face, heat it until the surface fractures, quench it with water, then use the hammerstones, some weighing up to 10 kilograms, to pound the copper free. It worked, repeatedly, for 2,000 years. But here's what you don't hear. This operation required coordination on a massive scale. You need people gathering wood, maintaining fires, carrying stones, hauling extracted copper, feeding and sheltering a workforce. On Isle Royale alone, an island with no permanent water source, reachable only by canoe across some of the most dangerous freshwater in the world, archaeologists found more than 1,000 individual mine pits along a single ridge called Minoan. This is not a small group of people picking up shiny rocks. This is organized, sustained, industrial extraction. The question is not whether there was an organized workforce. The question is, whose workforce was it? Now let's follow the copper. Because this is where the story goes from impressive to genuinely inexplicable. 1.5 billion pounds of copper. Extracted. Gone. Here's what the archaeological record of native North America shows from the same period. A modest tradition called the Old Copper Complex. Tools, weapons, ornaments. Beautiful work. Culturally significant. spread across the Great Lakes region, but not at a scale that accounts for the mining. Researchers have combed through every Native American site in North America from this period. The copper artifacts they found total, at most, a few percent of what was extracted. There are no mass storage sites, no warehouse pits filled with copper ingots, no archaeological layer showing where 5,000 mines worth of material ended up. The tribes themselves, in oral traditions, in the accounts they gave to early European explorers, described the copper as sacred, something their ancestors worked occasionally, not in the millions of pounds scale the mines suggest. Barry Fell, a Harvard marine biologist turned controversial epigrapher, once wrote, "The Indians did not mine it. Someone else did." Mainstream archaeology strongly disputes this. They maintain the local archaic peoples are the most logical answer. But the mainstream explanation has a gap the size of 1 billion pounds. So where did the copper go? The answer might lie in a coincidence. The kind of coincidence that keeps archaeologists awake at night. In 1200 BC, the mining at Lake Superior stopped. Not gradually, not in a slow decline as veins ran dry. Abruptly, the sediment record from the lake floor shows copper pollution falling off sharply right around 1200 BC. The archaeological evidence from the mine sites goes quiet. 5,000 pits, 2,000 years of industrial activity, and then nothing. Now, in the Mediterranean, in 1200 BC, the Bronze Age collapsed. Troy fell. Mycenae was burned and abandoned. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world, vanished virtually overnight. Egypt barely survived. The palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean, which had been built on a foundation of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, collapsed one by one within 50 years. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. They still argue about what caused it. But copper, a civilization that runs on bronze, needs copper. And the Mediterranean world, at its peak, needed far more copper than its own mines could provide. The mines in Cyprus, the island whose very name comes from copper, were depleted. The mines in Sardinia and the Iberian Peninsula could not meet demand. The Lake Superior mines were operating at maximum capacity during exactly the centuries when Mediterranean demand was highest. They stopped at exactly the moment the Mediterranean stopped needing them. This is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the archaeological record, or it is the most important connection nobody in mainstream academia wants to accept. And then the physical evidence starts appearing. Evidence that someone, at those Lake Superior mine sites, brought objects from the other side of the world. Here's where the story stops being theoretical. In the 1990s and 2000s, archaeologists and researchers cataloged something unusual at several Lake Superior mining sites: pottery sherds, fragments of ceramic vessels that bore stylistic resemblance to Minoan pottery from Crete. The same distinctive forms, the same decorative patterns. More striking, the mining tools themselves. Grooved hammerstones nearly identical to tools found in Bronze Age mining sites in Greece and Cyprus. Not similar in a vague sense, similar in specific design, specific weight distribution, specific grooving technique. Researcher Gavin Menzies and others have argued that the Minoans, the great maritime civilization of the Aegean, who controlled Mediterranean trade routes from roughly 2700 to 1450 BC, were the ones running the Lake Superior operation. They had the ships, they had the trade networks, they had the desperate need for copper, the mainstream archaeological response. Transatlantic contact is unproven. The similarities are coincidental. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Fair enough. But here's an uncomfortable fact the mainstream cannot explain away. The pottery at Lake Superior mining sites was made from local clay. It wasn't imported from Crete, it was made there, on site, in a Minoan style. Someone was living at those mines, making their pots in the way their culture taught them, far, far from home. And one final piece of evidence, written not in stone, but in blood. Genetics can reach where shovels cannot. The Ojibwa people, the indigenous nation whose traditional territory includes the Lake Superior region, carry something unusual in their DNA, a genetic marker called haplogroup X. Haplogroup X is rare. It appears in roughly 3% of Native Americans. That alone is unremarkable. But here's where it gets strange. Haplogroup X is also found in Europe and the Middle East, primarily in populations from the Mediterranean basin. Most Native American ancestral lineages trace back to migrations across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia. Haplogroup X does not match any Siberian population. It appears to have arrived in North America separately, and the mutation patterns within the haplogroup suggest the timing of its introduction was approximately 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. Which is to say, exactly when the copper mining was at its peak. The geneticists who discovered this finding were careful. They did not say Minoans sailed to Michigan. They said the data was anomalous. They said further study was needed, but the anomaly has never been resolved. A bloodline that shouldn't be there, in exactly the population that lives closest to the mines, arriving at exactly the time the mines were most active. The evidence does not prove the theory, but the theory fits the evidence better than anything else we have. And that leaves us with the final question, the one that no theory fully answers. Let's say the mainstream is right. The local archaic peoples mined all of it themselves. They traded it through networks we haven't fully mapped. It dispersed across a continent in amounts too small to easily trace. That would mean a Stone Age population, with no writing, no central government, no evidence of the kind of social hierarchy that organizes industrial labor, ran one of the largest mining operations in human history for 2,000 years. And then stopped. Completely. For reasons unknown. Let's say the alternative theory is right. Minoan or Phoenician or some unknown Mediterranean traders made contact, organized the extraction, shipped the copper across the Atlantic to feed the Bronze Age world. That would mean transatlantic contact happened 3,500 years before Columbus. That the history of human civilization we teach in every school is missing a chapter, and that when the Bronze Age collapsed in 1200 BC, not just a trade route ended, an entire hidden connection between worlds ended with it. Neither answer is comfortable. Both answers leave something unexplained. What we know for certain, someone extracted 1.5 billion pounds of copper from the shores of Lake Superior. Someone left 5,000 pits in the earth. Someone stopped in 1200 BC and never came back. And almost all of the copper is simply gone. The ground remembers. We just haven't learned to read it yet. 7 pieces of a puzzle that doesn't quite fit together. The scale of the mining, the industrial technique, the missing copper, the timing that matches the Bronze Age collapse to the decade, the pottery that looks Minoan but was made from Michigan clay, the genetic marker in the Ojibwa bloodline that came from the wrong direction. None of these facts alone proves anything. Together, they describe something that our current history cannot fully account for. The Lake Superior mines are still there. Royale is a national park. You can walk along Minoan Ridge and see the ancient pits yourself, filled now with rainwater, edged with lichen, quiet. The hammerstones are in museums. The copper is somewhere we haven't found. Maybe it is in a museum in Athens, classified as Mediterranean Bronze Age. Maybe it is dissolved into weapons and statues long since melted down. Maybe it is in the soil of a field in Crete, waiting. History is not a completed document. It is an ongoing argument between what we've found and what we haven't found yet. And sometimes, the most important discoveries aren't in the ground. They're in the questions we're still too cautious to ask. If you had to choose one explanation for the missing copper, the local theory or the transatlantic one, drop it in the comments. The answer says more about what we're willing to believe than it does about the evidence. And subscribe, because there are a lot of questions left to ask.